Hello, my name is John Haskell, Director of the John W. Kluge Center at the Library of Congress. The Kluge Center, in its efforts to bring scholarship relevant to the challenges facing us in the 21st century, is ably advised by a distinguished group of prominent scholars and thought leaders, the Scholars Council. One of its members, Lisa Anderson, is joining me today to moderate a timely discussion on foreign affairs, Trump legacies, Biden challenges, the Middle East in 2021. Lisa has been a member of the Scholars Council since 2015. Previously, she was president of the American University in Cairo, and she's Dean Emerita of the School of International and Public Affairs at Columbia University. Prior to her appointment as dean, she served as chair of the Political Science Department and the director of Columbia's Middle East Institute. She continues to teach there. Before coming to Columbia, she taught at Harvard University in the Government and Social Studies departments. She is joined by panelists Tamara Wittes, a senior fellow in the Center for Middle East Policy at the Brookings Institution. Wittes served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Near Eastern Affairs from November of 2009 to January 2012, coordinating U.S. policy on democracy and human rights in the Middle East during the Arab uprisings. Next, we have Rabab El Mahdi, Associate Professor of Political Science at the American University in Cairo. She specializes in comparative political economy and development with a focus on Latin America and the Middle East. El Mahdi's research interests cover the areas of state-civil society relations, social movements and resistance, as well as the political economy of social policy. And last, Mehran Kamrava, Professor of Government at Georgetown University, Qatar. He is the author of many journal articles and books, including most recently, A Concise History of Revolution with Cambridge University Press, also Troubled Waters, Insecurity in the Persian Gulf, and Inside the Arab State from Oxford. Thank you for joining us for this important conversation. Lisa?
Thanks, John, and thanks very much to our distinguished panelists for joining us today. In President Biden's first talk on foreign policy, he announced this is the message I want the world to hear today. America is back. America is back. And then he surveyed that world, touching on issues and places, allies and adversaries from China and Russia to Myanmar and the Paris Climate Agreement. He said in the only mention of the Middle East, quote, I've asked my Middle East team to ensure our support for the United Nations-led initiative to impose a ceasefire, open humanitarian channels, and restore long-dormant peace talks. He was talking about Yemen. The Middle East tends to impose itself on presidential agendas, however, and so it is an opportune moment to look at the region anew. And in fact, it seems to be in the midst of another turn of the kaleidoscope, as it were, as the familiar pieces fall into different patterns of alliance and antagonism. A lot of that seems to be at least in part attributable to the changed emphasis, rhetoric, and perhaps reality of the Biden administration, clearly different from its predecessor, as he himself has emphasized, and the efforts of various parties to explore the implications of the new U.S. regime. So I think what we'll do is start with the Gulf, in part because that is close to, at least, where the Biden administration started. Then we'll turn to Egypt and finally to the Israel-Palestine arena. And of course, a final few questions for everyone. But Mehran, I'd like to start with you. It looks like the boycott of Qatar is definitively over, and the consequences seem to be visible all over the region, from Libya's newfound conciliation to the apparent Egyptian-Qatari cooperation on the Israel-Gaza ceasefire. So what happened and why? How much did the change in the U.S. administration shape this development?
The change in the administration was the main reason why the Al-Ula agreement was signed and a reconciliation occurred after 3.5 years of bitter acrimony. I think before coming to the region, I had understood that regional actors, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Bahrain, and even Qatar, were dependent on the American security umbrella. But I understood that intellectually. But when I came here, I saw it close up. And it is incredible the degree to which this region feels its security dependent on the United States. And so a shift in the administration in Washington, the degree to which Riyadh and the White House under the Trump administration saw eye to eye was incredible. And that shift, everyone here thought Trump would win re-election. It was kind of 50-50, but everybody was rooting for Trump, the policymakers, except perhaps here in Doha. But once they realized that Trump was going to depart from the White House, everybody had to recalculate their immediate strategies and their agendas. And that was, I think, a definitive factor in bringing Saudi Arabia, in making Saudi Arabia revise its perspectives on the region, not just in relation to Qatar, but also in relation to Iran and Turkey.
Okay, great. We'll come back to this, but let's continue our tour around the region for a bit. Rabab, Biden cold-shouldered Egypt for months after he was elected. But now they seem to be talking several times a week, at least as the Israel-Gaza issues are on everyone's agenda. So what does that bode for Egypt in general and Egypt's role in the region?
Thank you, Lisa. So I want to build up on what Mehran was saying, in the sense that we're looking at a changing regional environment that came with the signaling the Biden administration brought about. So, there's no free lunch anymore. So we started to see those kinds of, it's almost a frenzy of rapprochements. The Saudis with the Iranis, the Egyptian with the Turkish, and the Qataris, and everyone who wasn't talking to anyone. And within that, Egypt is finding it an opportune moment to redefine its regional role, along with its weight and relationship towards the U.S. So this kind of recalibrating where it was from a place of support, but as a junior partner to the Saudis, a support from the Trump administration as a junior partner to the Saudis, to something very different where the Saudis do not carry the same weight, neither in the region nor with the American administration, but also for Egypt, having the current regime stabilized itself inside through immense securitization, to start building on the so-called Egypt's soft power, its role in the region, and to actually cash on this, not just from the US, but internally within the Egyptian society, and for continued support of the regime. Having said that, it could not have been more opportune for the unfortunate events that happened in Palestine and in Israel, because this actually helped the Egyptian regime for a very strong comeback, to basically try to inoculate itself against being marginalized or being pressured by the new administration. I'm happy to go on, but I think I should stop, or
no? I think that's true, and we will come back to that. Actually, why don't we put all or at least as many of the moving pieces on the table as we can? You go ahead.
Oh no, the final, just because I missed that part about the where does this leave Egypt and the relationship. I think the statement that came from the Biden administration, from the White House, following the Secretary of State visit to the Middle East. First of all, the first visit by this administration to the Middle East included, Egypt, in addition, of course, to Israel and Jordan. But it was not Saudi Arabia, it was not the AU, and this means something. And then the press statement was very, very revealing. First paragraph thanks the Biden administration, thanks the Sisi government for the amazing role it played in terms of the ceasefire and the conflict. Second paragraph, almost the exact same number of words, supports Egypt in its conflict with the Ethiopian government around the dam and the River Nile. And then one sentence, on Egypt's role in Libya and Iraq. And the very last sentence, and only one sentence actually, mentions human rights and uses the infamous term constructive dialogue, constructive engagement, which for the longest time was what governments used to justify their engagement with the apartheid regime in South Africa.
Great. Okay. No, thank you very much. Tamara, what extent did the change of the administration embolden or perhaps alarm actors in the Israel-Palestine arena? To what extent what we see develop only out of internal kind of dynamics, or was everybody looking at the U.S. and the change in administration as well?
Yeah, Lisa, thanks. I think it's important that we look at the sources of instability in the region as much as we look at the role of the U.S. administration. Oftentimes, I think we overstate the influence of American administrations on regional dynamics. And in the Israeli-Palestinian case, this is a crisis that has been brewing for quite a while. We've had a diplomatic vacuum since the exhaustion or breakdown or bankruptcy, use whatever term you like, of the Oslo negotiating framework. That was a vacuum that Secretary Kerry tried briefly to fill in the Obama administration without success. And the Trump administration really just exploited that vacuum, as did the Netanyahu government. And so you saw sort of the Overton window of unilateralism on the part of the Israeli government, and also in certain ways on the Palestinian side. You saw that window move, most particularly last year when the Trump peace plan, so to speak, proposed that Israel should have the unilateral ability to annex territory in the West Bank. And then Netanyahu and Benny Gantz in their coalition government last spring actually inked that intention into the coalition agreement. So that sort of broke open anything that was left of the constraints imposed by the Oslo negotiating framework on the relationship between Israelis and Palestinians. Essentially, at that point, the US government and the Israeli government had walked away from a commitment to negotiate this dispute. And so I think the ingredients of a crisis were there. The Biden administration came in not necessarily wanting to prioritize this crisis, but also not wanting to see it get worse. They had other priorities in the region, as I'm sure we'll discuss, primarily with respect to Iran and the Gulf. So, this was an example of the Middle East landing on the doorstep of an American administration. But I also think that everything we've seen in how they dealt with this crisis is illustrative of the dilemmas for any U.S. administration that wants to be less focused on this region, which is that if you want to ameliorate conflict, if you want to prevent crisis, if you want to manage crisis or promote stability, but you don't want to do it all yourself, then you have to lean more on your partners, no matter how imperfect those partners might be, no matter how troubled your relationships with them might be. And so I think this is what Rabab was just saying about Egypt is a perfect example of the way the United States ends up kind of overriding its best intentions in the name of seeking stability.
Okay. What is the likely outcome of this de-escalation of the conflict, the recent conflict? Do you see any substantive engagement by the United States, or is de-escalation all we hope for?
I think they recognize that de-escalation is insufficient. The situation now and the situation since the breakdown of Oslo has been one in which extremists have a lot of room to make things worse, and politicians have a lot of incentive to kind of engage in short-term steps that support their political interests but don't help the conflict. And so that requires active management. Ultimately, I think Israelis and Palestinians do need some kind of diplomatic horizon in order to reduce those incentives for extremism and troublemaking and crisis. But I don't think that this is a moment when the Israeli and Palestinian leaderships can engage effectively in negotiations. So the question is, how do we get from point A to point B? How do we get from this crisis back onto some kind of diplomatic pathway? That requires external actors, both in the region and in Washington and in Europe and elsewhere, to do a lot of dialogue with the parties on both sides, to talk across the political spectrum in Israel and Palestine, and to understand how can you take these parties, their interests, their concerns, where they are right now, and bring them back into a fruitful conversation. That might take a good while.
Oh, it probably will. But the interesting thing is, to me, is that the people with leverage, or the countries or regimes or individuals and so forth with leverage there, seem to be changing somewhat. So, Mehran, I want to go back to you. The Qataris seem to have been pretty important working with the Egyptians in helping the de-escalation of the recent conflict. So I wonder whether you think there is any kind of leverage in the Gulf, not only in that particular element of it, but you have the Abraham Accords. Are they going to be used for any purposes like de-escalation, like conflict resolution, so forth and so on? Or are they simply going to sit there as essentially a business arrangement?
It's interesting that each of the actors here in the region perceives of its leverage very differently. So the Qataris consider their leverage to be their ability to talk to different actors that don't necessarily talk to each other. So they try to use their hedging as a leverage between Saudi Arabia and Turkey, and then Iran and the GCC. Earlier, they were proposing throughout the Trump administration and at the beginning of the Biden administration, the Qataris were proposing to act as mediators between Iran and the United States until both the Iranians and the Americans said, thanks, but no thanks. We'll either talk through Muscat or we'll have our own track through Vienna and the framework of the JCPOA. The Emiratis consider their military prowess as their leverage, and now, of course, as you mentioned, the Abrahamic Accord as leverage to get concessions from Iran, and of course to get additional weapons purchases from the United States, and a more robust relationship, security relationship with the Americans. And the Saudis have been counting on their soft power, on their stature as the leader of the Islamic world and as the biggest actor in the Arabian Peninsula, as leverage with the Americans. And what we really see is that there's no coordinated strategy on the part of the Gulf Cooperation Council, whereas there are bilateral relations and bilateral dynamics at work that each actor perceives of its own roles very differently and its own leverage differently. The extent to which the Abrahamic Accords, to come to your specific question, will be used as leverage, and how that leverage will be used, I think is yet to be seen. It's too early. Most likely, if there is going to be leverage, at least for the Emiratis, it will be in relation to strategic coalition with with the Israelis against Iran.
Can I add something?
Yeah, we will get back to Iran, but go ahead.
Yeah, so the Abraham Accords, I think, are really interesting, and I'm curious to see the way this evolves. I don't think that left to themselves, the UAE and Bahrain would jump into the Israeli-Palestinian arena using the Abraham Accords as a vehicle. They made those agreements to open diplomatic ties with Israel for their own self-interested reasons, and the Israelis did it for their own self-interested reasons, and the benefits are there for them almost no matter what's going on with Israel-Palestine. Now, this most recent crisis kind of put them in a difficult spot in terms of domestic public opinion or regional public opinion, but it's not as though they're facing elections that they have to worry about. So they can manage those costs. And I think the question, there was this sort of notion put forward by some people when the Abraham Accords were announced, that this was a way to work the Arab-Israeli conflict from the outside in. Somehow. And I think that this crisis demonstrates that, the heart of this conflict is the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and you can't go outside in on that. You have to go inside out. So for the United States, I do think there's a possibility that you could leverage these relationships, leverage the fact that the Emiratis and Bahrainis want the Israeli-Palestinian dynamic to be better than it is right now. It would make their lives easier in cooperating with Israel. So could you give them some very concrete things to do that would help them play a constructive role? But I'm not sure that the Abraham Accords mean that we're going to see Gulf states replace Egypt, for example, as Rabab was saying, or Jordan, as the primary kind of Arab diplomatic mediators. I think Egypt and Jordan have unique roles, unique relationships, and the detailed understanding of the conflict that the Gulf states simply don't have.
Right.
And the location.
Yes, and the location. Well, it affects them immediately, right?
But I'm wondering now that it seems to me, as Mehran says, the Qataris are trying to be the go-between for everybody, that's a way of conceptualizing their view of, their comparative advantage, if you will. Actually, the historic go-between has been Egypt in many of these conflicts. And I just wonder whether now the Qataris and Egypt working together doesn't really represent an opportunity for both of them, one, to sideline some powers that they really would just as soon have an arm's length relationship with, and to change, we're always looking at these alliances and, adversaries and so forth, and they do move around a lot, but it does seem to me that this is, as Rabab suggested, an opportunity for Egypt. And so I wonder whether you can speculate a little bit about whether there is a shift, to work more with the Qataris, more with Turkey and so forth than they had been prepared to do before.
You being Tamara or being me?
You, Rabab.
Okay. Yeah, I think so. Two things, because Tamara raised important points. One is that this idea that Egypt will always be the go-between and the important regional power as opposed to the other small Gulfi states, at some point came to be threatened and not taken for granted. Both within the region, those aspiring smaller countries, and within Egypt itself. Right, this historical role was being challenged because of a number of reasons, both domestic and within the region itself. And this is changing. And I think it's changing because neither of the powers that you mentioned, Lisa, is finding it possible to actually get enough attention from the US administration on its own, the kind of support that it needs, or to be, their quote unquote, unfortunately, man in the region. And because the landscape of conflicts and actors has been changing and is much more complex than it was 10 years ago. You know, whether you're talking about Libya or Yemen or Syria, let alone, you know, the other places that seem to be stable, like Egypt, we're talking about a myriad of actors, that both of which are known and the unknown. And for that, you cannot have one mediator, whoever that is. So even in the last conflict that we're talking about, Egypt does and can play a role because of its, you know, historical relationship, but also because it's the only one that can actually give Hamas and Gaza some kind of release, so to speak, and accordingly maintain the ceasefire. But the Qataris has the money, and I often wonder that, you know, the $500 million that Egypt pledged for reconstruction in Gaza, you know, where are they coming from, right? So that partnership can serve everyone.
Exactly. Exactly.
May I
So
just,
you can see a common interest in that. I think that's what I just think that this could be sustainable over the course of time, despite all of the sort of ideological disputes that the Qataris
it will have to be it will have to be sustainable. And again, this I think we will. You know, Tamara was saying that we often overestimate the role of American administrations in the region, and totally the idea that, you know, they're going to come in, stride, and bring everything good. Not true. But again, having seen the impact that different administrations can have in and on the region just by mere signaling, not, you know, not any kind of anything material, I wouldn't say that we are overestimating the role. A lot of those changes that we are seeing now has to do with the fact that, you know, none of those actors was sure how the Biden administration would react to their actions.
Yeah.
may I just add
yeah, go
that?
ahead. Yes, go ahead, please.
You know, just to add to what Rabab was saying very succinctly, what we're witnessing is the fact that the GCC states are in many ways learning on the job. I hate to use a phrase that's been used quite often, but they have been punching above their weight. And in many ways now they're recognizing that they really do not have the resources, the depth, the deep bench that is necessary to effect change as they would like to, as they perceive. And so they're realizing that their roles are somewhat more limited. Qatar, for example, and to some extent the UAE, their influence is more limited than they would like. And so we saw this particularly in relation to Qatar, which pursued a hyperactive diplomacy up until 2011 and then had to pull back because it realized that you can't buy friends. You can rent friends with money, but no matter how much money you spend, ultimately you need human resources, you need a deep foreign policy establishment, you need resources on the ground, which they simply don't have. And the Qataris don't have it. The Emiratis are learning now that they don't have it. They don't have the deep bench that's necessary. And as a result, this diplomatic shift that we saw up until 2011, kind of a shift of gravity towards the Gulf, probably the pendulum is swinging back towards more traditional diplomatic heavyweights in the region like Egypt.
Yeah. All right, let's go now to Iran. And Mehran, I'm going to ask you to start us off on this, but Tamara said something I think we need to keep in mind, that it is possible that the UAE, particularly in Saudi Arabia and Israel, will be quite active in opposing any kind of, revival of the arrangements with Iran on the part of the United States. So tell us where you think that's going. Tell us what kind of regional opposition there may be and whether it could be effective. And then I'm going to ask everyone else to weigh in on that too.
Yes, well, as everybody has mentioned, the regional opposition to a rapprochement between Iran and the United States, or some sort of understanding, has been quite strong, and it comes from the Emiratis, the Israelis, the Saudis, and even if the Qataris say, "Oh, we want stability and peace in the region," they would much prefer there to be tensions between Iran and the United States so that they could capitalize on those kind of low-intensity tensions through arms purchases and the Americans looking the other way when it comes to human rights and other similar issues. But it does appear that at least there's a good chunk of the American foreign policy establishment that recognizes that Iran cannot be wished away, nor can its legitimate security concerns be completely overlooked in the way that they were done with the Bush administration and later the Trump administration. And so some sort of modus vivendi, some sort of understanding, some sort of a win-win scenario has to be accomplished between Iran and its regional neighbors and Iran and the United States. Precisely what shape that understanding might take, we're in the process of these negotiations in Vienna. One day they are moving in a positive direction. Today, the Iranian negotiator, recently, the Iranian negotiator signaled that the negotiations are likely to be prolonged and arduous, and so we don't quite know what the future of those negotiations are. But I think there are several things that are quite clear. First and foremost, the Iranians will not negotiate over their missile program because they see that as their only viable defense against the conventional military superiority of the GCC, the United States, and the various American bases that surround Iran. They're also unlikely to sever their relationship with militia and their proxy groups because, again, they see that as a source of leverage and as one of the only ways they can effect change on the ground. But I think there's also a realization in places like Riyadh and earlier in Abu Dhabi that you may not like your neighbors, but you're ultimately going to have to get along with them and come up with some sort of a win-win scenario where everybody sees some positives in the relationship.
Tamara, do you think that we're going to end up with some kind of arrangement where everybody is sort of sullen but willing to go along with it?
Well, sullen but willing to go along with it would be an improvement, sure. I do think it's important to emphasize that these negotiations in Vienna are only about the nuclear program. They are not about any of the other issues. And Mehran just made the very important point that we've actually had a good test over the last decade or so of how Iran would behave if it had, some kind of agreement on the nuclear question, some incentive to engage in a more constructive way with the region and the international community. Well, we saw that it continued with these non-state relationships, these efforts at domestic subversion in Arab countries. In other words, the pursuit of increased regional influence through a form of ideological and sectarian competition. Now, this was in the middle of the aftermath of the uprisings and a massive kind of uptick in sectarian tension region-wide, geopolitical competition region-wide. But the Iranians demonstrated very, very willing to play that game, even at the risk of alienating their partners in the JCPOA, in the nuclear agreement. So I think that's a lesson that's been learned in the region and in the world as we go into this next phase of negotiations. If we get back to a nuclear agreement with Iran, it solves one important but narrow problem. And that means that that a nuclear agreement cannot be a step on the path to normalizing Iran's relationship with the world or the region. There has to be a lot more done in terms of regional security dialogue, regional security infrastructure, ultimately. Now, one consequence of that may be that it helps to reassure Gulf states, for example, that they're going to have the attention of the United States and the support of the United States in dealing with that security challenge from Iran, even with a nuclear agreement. And I'm not sure they were convinced of that when the JCPOA was first put into place. So, I think there's a lot of scope for cooperation between the United States and its regional partners in dealing with the challenge of Iran. But I think the Biden administration's fundamental approach is we have to deal with Iran in a way that stabilizes the region, that ratchets down geopolitical competition in the region, whereas the approach of the Trump administration was to ratchet it up. And the Gulf states were ratcheting it up in their own ways, engaging in these proxy conflicts. So if everybody is now on the same page of de-escalation of regional conflict and promotion of regional stability, that to me is a very good path.
One quick follow-up. Do you think any Israeli government would be prepared to accept that kind of approach? I mean, at this point, we've seen the Israelis play a spoiler sort of role in efforts to try and come to that, even that limited relationship agreement with Iran.
Yeah, look, Netanyahu tried very hard to spoil the JCPOA in 2015, and he failed. And I think that's widely understood in Israel. Now, a nuclear agreement with Iran is unpopular across the Israeli political spectrum. There is really no disagreement on that. But I think when the JCPOA was first put into place, you did see some in the Israeli security establishment saying, okay, we can live with this, we can plan around it. And others saying, no, this is dangerous, they're going to cheat, and it makes everything worse. So I think the mode that the Israeli security leadership and Israeli political leadership is in right now is, we know the U.S. wants to do this, and so we got to figure out how to work with them on it, rather than the sort of all-out conflict that Netanyahu engaged in 2015.
Okay, great. Thank you. I have a couple other questions, and we don't have that much longer. We could obviously spend all day on these kinds of issues. I want to talk a little bit about what does seem to be actually a de-escalation of some of the other conflicts in the region. So to everyone's astonishment, the Libyans seem to be willing to live together in a tentative sort of way right now. Clearly, Yemen is not perhaps as neatly tied up as Libya, and Libya is not that well tied up yet, but there is really a sense across the region that that kind of constant debilitating conflict should lessen. And obviously that's partly, and I think Mehran, you kind of made this point, it was really in the interest of some of these regimes to have these sort of simmering problems all over the place, because it made them look more stable and it made them look more influential and powerful and reliable and a bunch of things like that. Something's beginning to change, and maybe we can start with you, and then Rabab, I want to go to you about kind of Egyptian approaches to some of this sort of thing.
Well, we all know that civil wars run their course ultimately, and the tragedy of the civil wars in the Middle East has been, as you mentioned, that we've had the deep involvement of foreign actors, and that has prolonged these tragic civil wars in Syria, in Yemen, in Libya, and of course the near civil war that seems to be in the offing perpetually in Lebanon. And so the involvement of these foreign actors. And so I think it appears that there's been some sort of understanding among these actors that these civil wars have not necessarily turned out the way they want, and that they have been an actual drain on their seemingly endless resources. It's very interesting that even in Iran, there's been open discussion in the media within the Revolutionary Guards of the expense of Iran's involvement in the Syrian conflict. And so there is this pressure across the board, even in ostensibly closed places like Iran, but also here in the Gulf, that these civil wars have to at some point necessarily end. And so whether or not we like the outcome, everybody has been trying to cling on to an outcome that they can claim as victory, or at least shape the outcome in a way that serves their purposes. But it appears as if, as you mentioned, that that the worst is behind us, and the different warring actors have learned that these civil wars are also not to their advantage.
Yeah. I think that's really, for a long time, I think they thought they were to their advantage. Rabab, how does it look from Egypt's perspective? And if you will, just tell us about how Egypt is looking at the civil war in Ethiopia.
Okay, so I think what we're looking at regionally is basically less intensity, but I'm not sure that it's necessarily over.
Okay.
Meaning that those conflicts will take another shape, just because the structural issues in terms of vying for regional power and redefining national interests and the kind of regimes behind all those conflicts are still the same. They are untouched. Hence, I think we're looking at a different way of doing things, but keeping in mind the same principles, issues that those regimes were after. Having said that, I think for Egypt, so two things for Egypt, meaning the Egyptian people and the Egyptian regime, because those are two very different things.
Separable, yes.
Yes. I think for the Egyptian regime, we're looking at a very, very opportune moment. As I said, things are changing. They're reconfiguring their positionality. They don't need to be championing neither the EU or Saudi Arabia, to get more money or whatever. They can reassert themselves as regional actors in their own right in any of those conflicts, and particularly in Libya and Palestine, which are taking priority now. Within and even the conflict that the Egyptian regime itself is in with the Ethiopian government, again, that is also serving its interest as a regime, because we're seeing two things that feed into the same nationalist, almost chauvinist discourse that multiple Egyptian regimes like. We're being attacked by the Ethiopians. This is a national priority. We all have to rally about the flag. And this is taking over, TV propaganda everywhere. Even the discourse on the street. At the same time, we're seeing an official visit by Abbas, the Egyptian official, the Egyptian general, to Gaza, where Gaza streets have billboards with Sisi's picture. Again, this is almost sort of a not the right moment of the 60s. So both those things feed within the Egyptian national scene into an more power and a different image of the current regime, as well as the nationalist discourse, but also regionally within. We are playing that national role. We will continue to play it, as I said, in Libya, in Gaza, but we need support in Ethiopia, both from regional powers, but more importantly, from the US and, to an extent, China and whatnot. Where that reconfiguration leaves societies of the region, I am very skeptical, right? Because the toll that the war would take in those different places definitely will be diminished. But again, we're talking about the same structural issues of human rights abuses, a lack of economic equity. All those things remain untouched and unchanged, whether by the current American administration redefining its relationship with the region, or by those different regional powers reshuffling their status. Does that even answer your question?
Yes, it does. Thank you. Tamara, did you have a comment? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I wanted to say, I mean, first of all, I could not agree more with what Rabab said. I think that the regimes in the region that in the immediate wake of the uprisings and the dictators in places like Libya and Syria then sparking civil conflict by using force against their own populations, it created this really maximal sense on the part of these regimes of what was necessary to ensure their own regime stability, their own survival. So the security dilemma for them was really intense, and they were willing to go to great lengths to pursue what they thought was necessary. So, for some, it was an all-out war on anything they thought was associated with the Muslim Brotherhood. For others, it was an all-out war on anything they thought was opposed to the Muslim Brotherhood, or what have you. I mean, so at this point, I think we see that threat perception is still there, but the means that they're willing to use to pursue their goals has shifted. And that was Rabab's point. I think it's really important to understand. So what we may see in Libya, for example, or in Yemen, is a negotiated compromise amongst domestic factions with international support. But once those compromises are in place, the regimes in the region with a stake are going to continue to try and have influence and seek advantage. And I worry that over time, that means that these pieces, even if a piece is achieved, that it might not be durable. It's only going to be, I think, once regimes in the region agree to live and let live, and everybody, can come to their own compromises that work in their own society, then I think we have a possibility of a more durable peace. But then we also get to the other issue Rabab raised, which is that the source of instability is domestic. It's indigenous. It's in gaps, economic inequality, corruption, the broken relationship between state and society, and this argument about what the state is for and how the state is supposed to relate to its citizens. That argument is going to go on even when all the proxy wars are finished. And, the only thing I can hope is that is an argument that can take place in peaceful channels rather than violent channels.
I think you're correct, all of you. I think the question is, have we come to a point where some of these governments are beginning, as I think Mehran suggested, are beginning to say, well, we may not be happy with this, but we are going to have to live and let live a little bit. That we are overextended, at least the Gulf countries are overextended and have really, invested too much in distracting attention from domestic issues by being involved in regional issues, a classic regime device. And so perhaps there will be the begin. So the point is, are we at a moment where we can see the beginning of that settling, which would be not the solution, but it would be a step toward governments having to address domestic problems, which they have been able to divert attention from American attention, international attention, domestic attention through their regional involvements.
So you started out, Lisa, with one external variable that's very important, which is the change of administration in Washington. But the other variable that I think is external variable that's having a big impact here is the price of energy and the role of these states in the global energy market. I mean, the Gulf states, Mehran mentioned, they can't spend like they used to. They're facing hard budget constraints. And so that is also affecting the choices that they make. But I think it's important to understand this is about relative priorities. This isn't about abandoning one objective in favor of another. And if oil prices go up again, might we see them throwing their money around again? Sure.
Okay. All right. So the landscape is still pretty open. There's still, if oil prices increase, then some of what we've seen and are attributing to a change in administration may actually reappear, and then it's obviously not a function of the change in administration. So I think this landscape is still pretty murky. I want to end with a general question to all of you, and then any other comments that you might want to contribute to this very needy discussion. As we've seen, and talking about the civil wars and so forth, but actually a lot of the countries of the region have operated for a long time with no real government. I mean, even Israel has gone from election to election to election. And Lebanon, I don't know whether there's a government right now. You never know in any given moment. And obviously, we know that's true in the countries that are racked with conflict. Iraq doesn't really have a full bore government and so forth. So what does that tell us about the importance of government in the first place? What are the kinds of dynamics here in the region that we should be thinking about for the longer term? And that if we do care about things like human rights and accountability and so forth, how do we have mechanisms by which governments actually appear and that anyone could hold accountable? So this is a big, big question, but it is, I think, important to recognize that some of the cliches, certainly in the United States about the Middle East, is these really strong autocratic governments. And in fact, in the last 10 or 15 years, that hasn't been as true as it ever was before. So we need to, sort of recognize that many of these governments are governments not even in name, and that clearly something is going to change over the course of time as a reflection of that dynamic. So any of you can start where you want. Maybe, Tamara, you could start with the Israelis who haven't had a government for a long time.
Yeah, so I guess, Lisa, I would shift the frame slightly, and I don't think it's just terminology. It's not about whether you have a government. It's about whether you have effective governance.
Okay.
You can say that Egypt has a government, but it doesn't have strong governance. It has very weak governance, right? Lebanon may not have a government, but it has certain types of governance, and then it lacks other types of governance, right? So I think that's what we need to look at, and especially as we look at the consequences of the COVID pandemic for this region, I think in a lot of places, citizens are looking at whether the governments they have were able to provide governance in this crisis. Could they provide adequate health care? Can they provide access to vaccines, et cetera? And so, Israel has had caretaker governance or short-lived governments. They've dealt with urgent things like COVID, but they have not been able to deal with other really important questions like the future of Israel's relationship with the Palestinians. And that has generated other kinds of crisis. Israelis have avoided answering questions about the future of their relationship with the Palestinians for years. And now I think those questions are coming to the fore again. And we'll see whether they get a stable government that is able to answer the longer term questions. But when I look at, the region today compared to the region that I first started studying a couple decades ago, or the region that you first started studying, Lisa, it is much more heterogeneous. There are lots of different experiments with governance, whether it's liberalized autocracy or intensely repressive autocracy or fragile democracy. We have, a lot of unfinished stories right now in Tunisia, in Algeria, in Iraq, in Lebanon. And so I guess as I think about the long term, my hope would be that everyone in the region can observe, participate in, learn from these various experiments and understand that there are wider possibilities for the future than perhaps what they have been living with. To me, that was, that demand for a different ending to the story was the demand behind the 2011 uprisings. It's a demand that you still see across the region today. I don't think it's going away. And so, I think the question for outside actors like the United States is how can we not get in the way of that? And how can we, where possible, support, good endings to that story?
No, thank you very much. I was going to ask as a sort of final coda to this, so I will pose this to Rabab and Mehran too. What are the so Tamara suggests we have to be careful not to get in the way. What are the two words you would say, not necessarily to the US administration, but to Americans in general, that we should be thinking about as we go forward, paying attention to the region? Mehran, why don't you take that, and then I'll go to Rabab.
Also, this would also build on the excellent point that Tamara made. I think our conceptions of state and society in relation to the Middle East need to change. We've historically thought of the Middle East as having strong societies and weak states, but we see in places like Iraq and elsewhere where there are so-called militia groups that are the ones that are effecting change on the ground, whether it's having health clinics or being able to collect the trash or provide security and traffic control in the roads. And so I think one of the things we need to look at is how do we bring these groups that have been on the margins of the political establishment, how do we encourage them to come into the political mainstream? Or how do we facilitate their incorporation into the political process, because they're the real links, the proverbial Hezbollahs, Lebanese Hezbollahs of the region. They are the proverbial links between this state and society, as we've thought through. So I think one of the ways is how do we work with them and how do we facilitate their incorporation into the political process, which I think is quite important.
Okay, that's a challenge for any administration. Thank you very much. Rabab, you're going to have the last word.
Thank you for not putting any pressure. I think a couple of things. There are key words. One of them is they're not mutually exclusive. The idea that you can, protect your national interests, the U.S. national interests in the region, push for security and stability without foregoing what, supposedly America stands for, and particularly this administration wanting to highlight things to do with human rights, liberal values, so on and so forth. They're not mutually exclusive. And I've never understood how can such administrations be so naive as to think that they need to be pushed into a corner of choosing between this and that. Most all of those regimes in the Middle East, when they act out of self-interest. So when they play this or that role, whether it's mediating or a gatekeeper, or even a soldier in some places, they're doing this because they have a stake. Accordingly, this is not a favor they're doing for any American administration, and that would deserve a price for letting them off the hook on other things. That is one, definitely one lesson. Another thing I think is redefining, and this is a very important a point that you raised, Lisa. I think for the longest time, and until now, which for me is very surprising, 10 years after the eruption of the first Arab uprisings, that still different US administrations look at the very limited set of actors within any country and throughout the region, particularly the state and whatnot. Whereas historically speaking, not just now, those countries in this region had a multiplicity of actors beyond, below, and above the state and formal institutions as we know them. That doesn't mean, I don't want to go into the Orientalist thing, they're all tribes killing each other, because that's not the case. But there are different forms of civil society actors. The rise of anything from Hezbollah to Hamas to the less informal groups that different US administrations like, liberal youth and whatnot, those did not come out of the blue. They've always been there, but they're outside the formal structures. And accordingly, this administration should maintain links and a balance and a broader vantage point when dealing and identifying actors in the region.
Thank you very much. I wasn't going to do this, but I will. An illustration of precisely the kinds of groups that you're talking about is just been published in a book from Georgetown in Qatar called Informal Politics in the Middle East. And it's not so much informal politics as it is political organizations of various kinds. And it just shows you how varied and how complex these societies have become. And it would really do all of any administration in the United States, or for that matter, anywhere in the world, a great service to become much more familiar with the complexity of the region. There are lots of different kinds of groups, lots of different kinds of advocates, lots of different kinds of ways of participating in efforts to have accountability. So thank you very much. Thank you all for this very fruitful conversation. I look forward to reconvening next year, I hope. Thank you.